trying to explain how we got from modernism, or the philosophy of the Enlightenment, to the postmodern predicament. And the first hypothesis I was sketching involved putting essentially epistemology at the fore, right, and then tracing the developments of epistemology primarily over the course of 200 years. And so the idea is that what you end up with is a kind of a dead end of skepticism, which engenders a subjectivism, which then engenders a relativism. And since relativism is a key part of the postmodern strategy, this seems like a natural fit. So then I posed a problem for that explanation, and the problem was that all postmodernists, to a man and woman, are socialist and fairly far left socialist. And that's a problem because if you would start from subjectivism, you would expect people to be making commitments all over the map. Instead, what we find is the commitments are narrowly directed to one part of the political spectrum. And so there's got to be another factor here to explain this. Now, another part of the problem that I left you with was that socialism has traditionally been defended on modernist grounds. The claim was that socialism was provable by the evidence, by the logic. Okay? So what you have then somehow is a shift, a major shift in strategy from modernist epistemological groundings for socialism to socialism being part of this highly relativistic postmodern strategy. So then the question is, why is this the case? All right, I did my homework actually a long time ago, so I'll just plunge in here. Since socialism was put forth on modernist grounds, this meant that it made, in effect, a number of core assertions or key propositions that it thought would be provable by evidence and logic. And I've got a slide here that includes the four of them. If you ask socialists to defend socialism, they'll typically offer two strands of argument. One is a more moral strand. They will argue a pair of theses, one that capitalism is deeply immoral, right? And then there are a number of reasons why it's immoral. It's exploitative. The rich get rich off the back of the poor. They enslave them. It's warlike as part of its imperialistic mission and so forth. Socialism, by contrast, is humane. It's peaceful. Everybody gets a share, or everybody shares. Everyone is cooperative, as opposed to the brutal competition that's characteristic of capitalism. So that's the first two. The economic wing of argument is that capitalism ultimately is unproductive. It's doing pretty good so far, but because of its internal contradictions and problems, it will ultimately collapse. It will sow the seeds of its own destruction. Socialist economies, by contrast, will be more productive, and they will usher in a new era of prosperity. Now, this then means that socialism has made some definite theses that can then be tested against the evidence and given logical scrutiny. The problem then is that every single one of these claims has been extensively refuted, both in theory and in practice. We've had over 100 years of socialist argumentation, several socialist experiments, and in each case they reached dismal failure. And it's brutal, at least from our perspective, how thoroughly socialism has been discredited. In theory, if you focus on the free market economists, people like Mises, Hayek, and Friedman have made the case. They've shown how markets are more efficient, and they've shown conversely how socialist command economies are bound to fail, necessarily. They have to. Distinguished socialists such as Robert Heilbronner have conceded in print that that debate is over and that Mises and Hayek won. In theory, the political debate is a little more up for grabs, okay, but the leading thesis, I think, at least on my reading, is that some form of liberalism is the leading contender, that if you're going to protect human rights in some broad form, you've got to have some form of liberalism, whether it's a more conservative version or a more communitarian version or a more libertarian version. That's where the debate is. It's all shifted to there. The empirical evidence has been much harder on socialism than the theoretical debate. Economically, in practice, every single socialistic country has failed, and failed dismally. And in practice, every country that is by and large capitalist has become prosperous. and increasingly prosperous, and there's no end in sight here. Politically, in practice, every single capitalistic country has a good record on human rights issues and respecting rights and freedoms, by and large making it possible for people to put together meaningful, fruitful lives. Socialism has time and time again proved to be more brutal than the worst dictatorships in history. Every socialist regime has collapsed into dictatorship and starts killing people on an unprecedented scale. Every single one produces dissident writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Nian Cheng, who document from a first-person perspective or first-hand perspective what exactly goes on. Now, if you have that handout, the green one from yesterday, I've got one piece of empirical data. Yeah, the green one, okay, on the back, down at the bottom with the second table. It's a political scientist named R.J. Rummel who has done a lot of work in the trenches trying to come up with statistics that would empirically ground or not the socialist claims and so on. And what you find is in two fronts. If you can compare the liberal democratic countries on the record of peacefulness versus warlikeness, and you can compare human rights records, that's the other one I was groping for. You can compare how much liberal democratic countries protect their own people and look after them and leave them free versus at the other end kill them, right, and not make it possible for them to lead fruitful lives. And if you just go through this one here is the one that scares me a lot. In democratic countries, more people have been killed by war than killed by their own government. In authoritarian governments, the numbers are still, actually they reverse the other way, right? You have twice as many people killed by the government as killed in international wars, and in totalitarian nations, the numbers are just horrifying. Right? And so in here you've got, of those 138 million, you'd have the 6 million in the Holocaust, killed by the Nazis, but that's kind of small potatoes compared to Stalin, compared to Mao, and so on. And it's interesting that the Vietnam War, for example, if you look at those statistics, which was pretty nasty, I think it was about 1.2 million people were killed during the war on both sides. But in the immediate 8-year period after the war ended, the Vietnamese government killed 2 million. So war was better for the Vietnamese than peace, okay? Now these statistics are at least as objectivists and people in the free market side of the debate, and the liberal side of the debate, we suspect that those statistics are going to be there when the data comes in. And so they come in and we say, well, yeah, of course, that's what we expect. It's terrible, but that's the way it is. What I am emphasizing these points for is to try to get us to imagine what kind of a psychological impact the sum total of this, refutation in theory and practice in politics and economics, must have had on a socialist, okay, a true believer socialist. By the 1960s, right, there had been over 100 years of argumentation in economics and in politics, and the socialists could sense that they were losing. And by the 1960s, it was clear that the great socialist experiments were failing nastily. Okay? So put yourself in the shoes of a smart, more or less open to the evidence socialist, and you're confronted with all this data. How do you react? You've got a deep commitment to socialism. You feel that it's true. You want it to be true. You've pinned all of your dreams of a peaceful and a prosperous society on socialism, and all of your hopes for curing any ills that you see in current society. Now, this is a moment of truth for anyone who has experienced the agony of a deeply cherished hypothesis run aground on the rocks of reality. What do you do? Do you abandon your theory and go with the facts? Or do you find, or try to find, a way to maintain your theory and your belief in it? Now, there's a historically parallel example that I alluded to earlier, or yesterday, and I want to draw a parallel here. I think in the 1960s, the academic left was facing the same dilemma that religious thinkers were facing in the 1700s, the late 1700s. In both cases, the evidence was overwhelmingly against them. During the Enlightenment, religion's natural theology arguments were widely seen as being full of holes, and science was rapidly filling the gap. It was giving naturalistic and opposite explanations for the kinds of things that religion had traditionally explained. Religion was, again, in danger of being laughed out of intellectual debate. By the 1960s, the left's arguments for the fruitfulness and decency of socialism were failing in theory and practice, and capitalism was rapidly increasing everyone's standard of living and showing itself respectful of human freedoms. By the late 1700s, religious thinkers had a choice: accept the evidence and logic as the ultimate court of appeals, and thereby reject their deeply cherished religious ideals. Or, and here's the strategy, you can reject the idea that logic and evidence are the ultimate court of appeal. I had to deny knowledge, wrote Kant in the Critique, in order to make room for faith. Faith, writes Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling, requires the crucifixion of reason. And so he proceeded to do that and glorify the irrational. The left thinkers of the 1960s faced the same choice. Confronted by the continuing flourishing of capitalism and the continued poverty and brutality, they decided, like Kant, to limit reason, to try to crucify it. And so Heidegger, coming along and exalting feeling over reason, is a godsend. Kuhn's theory-laden paradigms, Quine's pragmatic and internalist account of language and logic do the same thing. So the idea here is that the dominance in the academy of skeptical and irrationalist epistemologies provides the academic left with a new strategy. Confronted by ruthless logic, harsh evidence, they have a solution. That's only logic and evidence. Logic and evidence are subjective. You can't really prove anything. Feelings are deeper than logic. And my feelings say socialism. So that's my second hypothesis about the origins of postmodernism. And I call it the Kierkegaardian hypothesis. Right? That socialism is the crisis of, postmodernism is the crisis of faith of the academic left. Okay? Its epistemology justifies taking a personal leap of faith and continuing to believe your socialist ideals. All right, so far what I've done is two things. I've tried to account for socialism's subjectivism and relativism on the one hand, and its monolithic left-wing politics on the other, and saying that there's a deep connection between the two. Now, if this is correct, putting those two together, what we get out of this is what I call reverse Thrasymachieanism. Okay? Yeah, that's the syllables. Okay. Now, the illusion here, right, is philosophers playing games. The connection is to the sophist Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. All right? And some postmodernists, actually many of them, see a big part of their project as rehabilitating the sophists who've been out of favor for a couple of thousand years. And this makes perfectly good sense. Right? Now suppose after doing some philosophy you come to believe truly in subjectivism and relativism, as the sophists do. Accordingly, you come to believe that reason is derivative, will and desire rule, society is a battle of competing wills, words are just tools in the power struggle for dominance, all's fair in love and war. That's, of course, what the sophists argued 2,400 years ago. Now, the only difference, then, between the sophists and the postmodernists is whose side the postmodernists are on. Thrasymachus, in Book 1 of the Republic, is kind of a representative of a fairly crude second-generation sophist. And what we find in him is subjectivist and relativistic arguments marshaled in support of the claim that justice is simply the interests of the stronger. Okay? The postmodernists, coming after 2,000 years of Christianity, 200 years of socialism, simply reverse that. Subjectivism and relativism are true, except they're on the side of the weaker and historically oppressed. Justice, contrary to Thrasymachus, then, is the interest of the weaker. Now, I like this hypothesis because I made it up. But I think it still leaves something out. And I think what it leaves out is some psychological components of postmodernism. The first part of the problem is that I find it hard to believe that the leap of faith goes down very far for most postmodernists. The average postmodernist is a very clever person, has a PhD in the humanities somewhere. So I find it tough to believe that, or to make psychologically real for myself, the kind of turning off of one's mind that would be necessary to make and sustain that leap of faith. Maybe I need to have an expanded understanding of psychology, but I think there's something else going on here. Let me give you some examples. Some fairly clear contradictions in the postmodernist assertions, okay, that any person who is smart and clever has to be aware of. Okay? On the one hand, all truth is relative. Okay? On the other, postmodernism tells it like it really is. Okay? On the one hand, all cultures are equally deserving of respect. On the other, Western culture is uniquely destructive and bad. Values are subjective, right? But sexism and racism are really evil. Okay? Technology is bad and destructive. It's unfair that some people have more technology than others. Okay? Tolerance is good and dominance is bad, but when we, speaking as postmodernists, are in power, we're as politically correct as hell. Now, there's a common pattern here. What you have is subjectivism and relativism in one breath, dogmatic absolutism in the next. Okay? Now, postmodernists are not stupid, right? So we can't just say they don't know that this contradiction exists. They're aware of the contradictions, right? And we're pointing them out to them all the time, right? All of the critics. Now, of course, you can say, kind of dismissingly, well, that's just a logical contradiction, right? And you've got a lot of stuff I took off that will comfort you in that. But I think it's one thing to say that, okay, and it's another thing to sustain it psychologically inside. So it makes me wonder, which side then of the contradiction is really deepest for a postmodernism? Is it the subjectivism and relativism, or is it the dogmatic absolutism? Is it they really believe in the relativism and occasionally lapse into absolutism, or is the absolutism deepest and the relativism is some sort of a tactical cover or other? Now here's three examples. This time it's blatant clashes between theory, postmodernist theory, and historical fact. Okay? Postmodernists will say that the West is deeply racist, but they know very well that the West ended slavery for the first time, and that it's only in places where Western ideals are making inroads that racism is on the defensive. They will say that the West is deeply sexist, but they know very well that Western women were the first to get the vote, contractual rights, and that they have opportunities that most of the women in the world are still without. They will say that the Western capitalist countries are cruel to their poorer members, subjugating them, getting rich off them, but they know very well that the poor in the West are far, far richer than poor people in other countries, both in terms of material assets and in terms of opportunities to improve themselves. So there's something else going on here, definitely. Okay. I'm going to argue that most postmodernists don't really believe much of what they say, that the word games, the accusations, and that much of the use of anger and rage that is characteristic of their style is not a matter of using words to state things that they think are true, but rather of using words as weapons against an enemy that you still hope to destroy. Think of the use postmodernists will sometimes use of science, for example. You find fairly regularly Einstein's relativity theory. That shows everything's relative, right? Quantum mechanics shows that we can't know anything, right? Chaos mathematics shows that the world is irrational, right? Gödel's incompleteness theorem, right? We've heard of all of these things. Now, these are all cited as proving the postmodernist epistemology, but it's fairly clear, especially when you speak to people who enunciate these claims. Here you've got a graduate student in English literature, okay, or some equivalent. Right? They don't know the science, okay, but they are citing the science. Now there's a fun incident. Alan Sobel, a physicist, and Social Text, which is a postmodernist journal, and he wrote an article showing that all of the recent discoveries in physics prove inexorably that postmodernism is true. Submitted it, was accepted, published, and it was all nonsense. Right? He just wrote it to show that the postmodernists don't know anything about science and that they will just prove anything. Now the reaction, or they'll just say anything, okay? Right, if it seems. So the reaction of the editors clearly shows this. Okay? They were not arguing, oh no, we think that this interpretation of science is true. Right? They knew they had been caught out in a con game. So it can't be that they are publishing these words because they think they're true. They are using the words as a rhetorical weapon. Okay? Truth is not the issue here. All right, so we got three options that I'm going to try out to explain the contradiction between the relativism on the one hand in postmodernism and the absolutist PC politics. Okay? First option we've got is that the relativism is the deepest part and the absolutist politics is secondary. And you could say, qua philosophers, postmodernists will preach relativism, but qua particular individuals, they have their own particular agenda, and that's what they assert, absolutely. The second option is to say that the absolutist politics is the deepest, and the relativism is a tactic that's put on in order to advance those politics. And how that would work, we can get into. The third option is that both the relativism and the absolutism do in fact exist in the postmodernist mind, and the contradiction just does not bother them psychologically. I'm going to rule out the first one as a possibility. The relativism can't be the deepest thing simply because the politics is so uniform. Okay? I think that argument shows that. Postmodernism is first a political movement. It's a political movement that has only recently come to relativistic arguments. So let's try the second option, that postmodernism is first about politics and only secondarily about relativist epistemology. So I'm going to try out the idea that the postmodernists are not relativists at all. Okay? That the relativism is part of a political strategy, a kind of a Machiavellian realpolitik thrown in to throw the opposition off track. Okay? All right, suppose you're at a bar. All right, you're arguing politics, right, with a fellow student. You can't believe it, right, but you seem to be losing the debate. You keep getting backed into corners. Okay? You find yourself then saying things like, well, it's all a matter of opinion. It's just semantics. Now, what's the purpose of saying that in that context? Well, it's to get the guy off your back, right, to give yourself some breathing space. Right? If your opponent accepts that everything is a matter of opinion, that it's all just semantics, for example, then you're seeming to have lost the argument, doesn't much matter, right? He's just using words in a different way than you were. On the other hand, if he doesn't accept that everything is just semantics or that it's all a matter of opinion, then he has the rather daunting strategy of proving that not everything is a matter of semantics and just opinion. So his attention then is diverted into doing some epistemology. And so then he's got a really difficult task ahead of him. All right, suppose he takes it on. And I don't know, suppose he's taking the semantic argument. Suppose he's doing a pretty good job on the semantics argument. Well, then you can just say, well, what about perceptual illusions? Okay? All right, and then he's off and running on that one for a while. Okay? Now, meanwhile, what this has done is got yourself out of hot water, got some breathing space, and it has diverted him from, in effect, going in for the kill on your politics. Now let's make the connection to socialism's current state. Socialism currently is in disarray. Right? It's feeling beat up on by history and its opponents. But rather than believe that the battle against capitalism is really lost, you could simply go underground, do whatever it takes to throw the enemy off guard and divert him from, in effect, going in for the kill on socialism. But if evidence and logic aren't on your side, then your only weapons are rhetorical and political manipulation. And here, relativist arguments are going to be very useful because they cause conniptions, right, in people who are modernist, who believe that there are such things as universal truths and so forth. And so they then are diverted into the epistemology. They go off and write long books about relativism and why it's false and pernicious and so forth. But in the meantime, while they are doing that, they're not attacking your politics. Okay? They're not defending their own politics. And so they're leaving the field open for you to regroup and come back again later. Frederick Jameson, whom I mentioned earlier, he's a major postmodernist literary critic, is famous for having said, did I say something funny? Okay. Everything is, in the last analysis, political. Now this strikes me as deeply Machiavellian, as a statement of a willingness to use any weapon, rhetorical, epistemological, political, to achieve one's ends. If so, a postmodernist doesn't have to believe the relativism in order to use it as a tactic. It works to destabilize the opposition, and the end justifies the means. Relativism then, on this interpretation, is postmodernism's big lie. It's a pretense. Really, they believe left politics absolutely, and they're just buying time while they're regrouping. Now here's an example. I didn't just make this up. Kate Ellis is a radical gender feminist. Ellis, as she writes in Stories Without Endings, believes that sexism is objectively and absolutely evil. Affirmative action is objectively good. Capitalism and sexism go hand in hand. Achieving gender equality requires the overthrowing of existing society. But she has a problem, she says, when she tries to teach her students these themes. Her students think like liberal capitalists. They think in terms of equality of opportunity, of judging everyone by the same standards, of removing the artificial barriers that women have faced. They think that by personal effort and ambition, they can overcome most obstacles and achieve success. This means to her that her students have bought into the whole liberal capitalist framework that she thinks is dead wrong. So, Ellis writes, she will enlist deconstruction as a weapon against those old-fashioned Enlightenment beliefs. If she can first undermine their belief in the superiority of capitalism, of Western values, the idea that people make or break themselves, their core values will be destabilized. Pushing relativism, she finds, helps achieve this. And once their Enlightenment beliefs are hollowed out by relativistic arguments, she can then again turn absolutist and fill the void with politically correct principles. Now, a familiar analogy here may help. I'm proposing that postmodernists are no more relativistic than creationists are, in their battles against evolution. Postmodernists wearing their multiculturalist garb will say all cultures are equal, not evil, but they are just like creationists who say that all they want is equal time for creation and evolution. Creationists will sometimes say things like both creationism and evolution are equally scientific, or they will say both are equally based on faith. Do the creationists really think that? Well, hell no. They're opposed to evolution. They are convinced that it's wrong and that it's evil. And if they were in power, they would suppress it. However, in the short term, as a tactic, since they're on the losing side right now, they will push for intellectual egalitarianism. And they will argue that nobody knows the absolute truth. The same holds for the postmodernists. They say they want equal respect for all cultures, but really, in the long run, what they want to do is suppress the Western one. I think this Machiavellian interpretation explains why relativistic arguments are arrayed against the Western great books canon. If your deepest goals are political, you always have a huge obstacle to confront: the powerful books written by brilliant minds on the other side of the debate. And there are always lots of them. For example, in literature, there's a huge body of staggeringly wonderful novels, plays, epic poems, and not very much of it supports socialism. A lot of it presents very compelling analyses of the human condition from opposed perspectives. In law, another place where postmodernism is very strong, the Constitution and the whole body of common law precedent provides a very powerful obstacle to many socialist agendas. So if you're a left-wing graduate student or a left-wing professor in literature or law, you've got two choices. You can take on those opposing traditions, have your students read the great books and read the great decisions, and argue with them and about them in your classes. Now that's very hard work, and it's also risky, right? Because they might come to believe the wrong thing. Or you can try to find a way to dismiss the whole tradition so that you can teach the books that fit your politics. If you're looking for shortcuts, or if you have a sneaking suspicion that your side won't fare very well in the debate, deconstruction is seducing. Deconstruction allows you to dismiss whole literary and legal traditions as built upon sexist or racist or otherwise exploitative assumptions. That way, you can claim justification for setting them aside. Now, suppose you're making this argument. Do you really have to believe that Shakespeare was a sexist? or that Hawthorne was a secret Puritan, or that Melville was a technological imperialist. No. You just make those arguments, you rid yourself of an obstacle, and then you don't have to read the challenging books, you don't have to explore opposing perspectives, and you don't have to have arguments against them. All right, that's the Machiavellian explanation. Postmodernism is not so much a leap of faith for the academic left, but a political strategy that uses, but does not believe, relativism. But one final darker psychological twist to add. I have not yet accounted for the nastiness, the obsession with darkness and destruction, perversion, that is characteristic of much postmodernist writing. In older socialist writing, you can often see signs of resentment, envy, anger, exulting in the destruction that the socialist revolution will bring, how those capitalists will finally get what's coming to them. With postmodernism, the negative emotionalism is often more extreme. The sheer love of deconstruction, the chronic deployment of crude ad hominem argument. In my reading of the whole history of the Western tradition, these are unprecedented. Stanley Fish calling all opponents of affirmative action bigots, lumping them in with the Ku Klux Klan. Andrea Dworkin's male bashing in the form of calling all heterosexual males rapists. The rhetoric behind it is harsh, okay? Or at least behind the emotion, behind the rhetoric, there seems to be strongly felt negative emotion. Okay? Racism and sexism are obviously the current hot issues, so we might expect overheated language in debating them. But the same vituperation is leveled against historical figures, all of those bad, dead, white European males. So if you are reading deconstructions of great authors like Shakespeare, you don't find things like, you know, Shakespeare really is great, and it's kind of sad that I have to point out this element of sexism in him. Okay? It's kind of a gleeful dismissing of all of Shakespeare, okay? Because he's got these sexist elements in them. So I want to try to capture this psychological component as well. Okay? And I find that for me, what is most illuminating is Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment. Okay? Ressentiment in the French is close to the English resentment, but it's got kind of a more curdled bitterness. You know, it's more seething and poisoned and bottled up for a long time. Okay? That's ressentiment. Okay? We're trying to project this psychological state. Now, I kind of like the idea of using Nietzsche here in analyzing the postmodernists because he's one of the heroes of postmodernism. Right? They cite him for his perspectivalism in epistemology, his use of kind of the enigmatic and loosely structured aphoristic form instead of the more scientific treatise form, his psychological acuteness in unmasking various guises, which is core to the deconstruction methodology. I want to use Nietzsche against the postmodernists for a change. Nietzsche uses the concept of ressentiment in the context of developing his famous account of master and slave morality, in Beyond Good and Evil most famously, and more systematically in The Genealogy of Morals. Master morality for Nietzsche is the morality of the vigorous, life-loving, strong. It's the morality of those who love adventure, delight in creativity, in their own sense of purposefulness and assertiveness. Slave morality is the morality of the weak, the humble, those who feel weak, they're victimized, afraid to venture forth into the big bad world. Weaklings are the chronically passive, largely because they are afraid of the strong. As a result, the weak feel frustrated. They can't get what they want out of life. They become envious of the strong, and they also secretly start to hate themselves for being so cowardly and weak. But no one can live thinking that he or she is deeply hateful. And so the weak invent a rationalization that tells them they are the good and the moral because they are weak, humble, passive. Patience is a virtue. Right? So they have to wait a long time before they ever get something what they want. So patience is a virtue. Obedience is a virtue. Okay? They can't do their own will. They have to obey. So make it a virtue. Humility. And so is being on the side of the weak and the downtrodden, people just like you. And so, of course, the opposites of those things must be the evil. Aggressiveness, pride, independence, being physically and materially successful. Does this sound familiar? Sure. But of course, Nietzsche says it's a rationalization. And a smart weakling is never quite going to convince himself of it. And that will do damage inside. Meanwhile, the strong will be laughing at him. And that will do damage inside. And the strong and rich will carry on getting stronger and richer and enjoying life. And seeing that will do more damage inside. Eventually, the smart weakling will feel such a combination of self-loathing and envy of his enemies that he will need to lash out. He will feel the urge to hurt in any way he can his hated enemy. But of course, he can't risk direct physical confrontation. He's a weakling. His only weapons are words. Now, in our time, the capitalists are the strong, the exuberant, the active. For a while in the past century, socialists could believe that the revolution was coming, that woe would come to them that are rich and blessed would be the poor. But that hope has been dashed cruelly. Capitalism now seems like a case of twice two makes four. And like Dostoevsky's Underground Man, it's easy to see that the most intelligent socialists would just hate that fact. Socialism is the loser, and if the socialists know that, they will hate that fact. They will hate the winners for having won, and they will hate themselves for having picked the losing side. Hate, as a chronic condition, leads to the urge to destroy. But again, your only weapons are words. How can you use words to destroy? I think the whole idea of deconstruction comes out of this. Postmodernism is populated by large numbers of people who like the idea of deconstructing other people's work. It's the opposite of constructing something of your own. Now consider parallel examples from the world of visual art. I think the visual art world was a little ahead of the postmodernists this century. Asked to submit something for display at the Art Institute of Chicago, Marcel Duchamp sends a urinal, which is then displayed. This makes a statement about art. Art is something you piss on. Or there's the painter de Kooning's version of the Mona Lisa, a reproduction he makes of Leonardo's masterpiece with a cartoonish mustache added. Now that too makes a statement. Here's an achievement I can't hope to equal, and so I'll turn it into a joke. I'll, in effect, destroy it. So you become a bully and a thug, not because it destroys something bad, but just because it feels good to wreck something. So if words are your weapons now, and you want to destroy the achievements of Western civilization, especially the Enlightenment, how do you do it? Well, consider a more personal case. If you hate someone and you want to hurt him, hit him where it counts. Do you want to hurt a man who loves his children and hates child molesters? What would be the worst thing you could say about such a guy? Well, accuse him publicly of child molesting. Or better yet, spread sneaky rumors that he's a child molester. Do you want to hurt a woman who takes pride in her independence? Spread through the gossip grapevine that she married the man she did because he's wealthy. Now, the truth or the falsity here of the rumors doesn't matter. And whether you believe them yourself doesn't matter. And whether the people you believe them or tell them to really believe them doesn't matter. They get out there and they do their damage. What matters is that you score a direct hit in the psyche of your enemy, your target person. You know that the accusations and the rumors are going to cause some tremors, even if they come to nothing. And you get that wonderfully dark glow inside of knowing that you did it, right? And they might just come to something after all. Now, my best example of this psychology comes from the deadest and whitest of the dead white European males, and that's Shakespeare. Think of Iago and Othello. Now here, I think Shakespeare nailed this psychology centuries ago, long before the postmodernists. What we've got is Iago just hates Othello, but he couldn't hope to defeat him in open confrontation. So how best to destroy him? Well, hit him where it hurts most, his passion for Desdemona. Hint that she's been sleeping around. spread subtle lies and innuendo, raise a doubt in Othello's mind about the most beautiful thing in his life, and let that doubt work like a slow poison. Now, like the postmodernists, Iago's only words or weapons were words. The only difference between the postmodernists and Iago is that the postmodernists are hardly subtle. Now let's bring it back to then the Western tradition. The Western tradition, it prides itself on its commitment to equality, justice, open-mindedness, making opportunity available to all. The West is proud, full of itself, confident, and it knows that it's the wave of the future. This is unbearable to someone who is totally invested in an opposite and failed outlook. And so that pride is what you want to destroy. Your best bet then is to attack the West's sense of its own moral worth. Attack it as racist and sexist then, as inherently dogmatic and cruelly exploitative. Undermine it at the core. The words don't have to be true in order to do their damage. And so I don't think it's accidental that postmodernism has launched the kinds of attacks on the core values of the West, and it's done so knowing full well that the accusations it's making are not true. It's a psychological compulsion in some cases, and so that allows you to hold the contradiction. You can be an absolutist in your assertions, and you can assert the relativism, and it just doesn't matter. As long as it's harming someone, right, your enemy, that's fine. That's the final explanation, or my final hypothesis here. I call it the nihilist explanation, for obvious reasons. I think some postmodernists, the worst of them in many ways, are individuals of deep ressentiment psychologically, and that the combination of alienation, bitterness, envy, and rage leads them to lashing out with an intent to destroy any aspect of culture that seems to them to be the opposite. All right, now I was going to bring a slide, but I forgot, so let me kind of summarize the whole thing in a little flow chart. I think it starts here, we'll use Marx as a name, with socialism. Socialism is the deepest part. Socialism goes along until the middle part of the 20th century, and then it reaches a crisis. In parallel, what's going on in epistemology, starting with Kant, is a development that leads in the middle part of the 20th century to some sort of relativism and subjectivism. Okay. The left's thinkers at this point, confronting their crisis, are looking for a way out. And so what they do is they integrate this, and you get a little aha phenomenon. Let's put these two together. And then at this point, in effect, the philosophy is done, and what you then have is three possible routes to explore, depending on what your psychological preferences are going to be. The first option is the Kierkegaardian option. If you want to maintain your belief in socialism as an article of faith, against all of the evidence, this relativism and subjectivism will do that for you. So this will justify the leap of faith for you personally continuing to believe in the socialism. If you need a new strategy, argumentative, rhetorical strategy, in order to try to continue the battle against capitalism, then what you will do is adopt a Machiavellian strategy. This means that you will continue to believe in your left-wing politics. You won't necessarily believe the relativism, but you will employ it as a political tactic against capitalism. And then finally, if this crisis is legitimate and deeply felt, then what you will have is just an urge to destroy capitalism. Not because you're ultimately thinking socialism is going to win, not necessarily that you personally believe it anymore, but what you then have is just a straight nihilism here. So that's my argument. I haven't argued today that postmodernism is false. Okay. Or yesterday. This has mostly been intellectual history. Okay. And I wouldn't argue that any of the issues that it raises can be set aside. The issues of skepticism, realism versus anti-realism, the relationship between reason and emotion, the dimensions of individualism and collectivism in human nature, all of these are ongoing debates in the intellectual community, and they should continue to be so. What I think my argument shows is that postmodernism, that collection of ideas, is a function of left-wing politics. Postmodernism is a rhetorical strategy developed by the left's deepest thinkers in response to the felt crisis of the old left. It's a movement that was set by the agenda was set by the deepest thinkers, and it's being carried out on a variety of intellectual fronts: literary theory, education theory, legal theory, and so on. And I think on all of those fronts, especially the epistemological front and the political front, the battles have to be engaged in all of their various dimensions. The postmodernist philosophy is the death knell of everything the Enlightenment stands for. It took centuries of philosophy to overturn feudalism and make the Enlightenment possible. And philosophical battles are never over forever. And so the Enlightenment's philosophical tradition needs constant rejuvenation in order to maintain its successes. It's worth pausing here, I think, for a moment, just to consider exactly what's at stake, what the Enlightenment achieved and what postmodernism is rejecting. And here's a list of the Enlightenment's successes. Science, both in the explosion of knowledge that science has created and in the conceptual idea of there being a scientific method that you can apply self-consciously. Engineering, the systematic creation of new technologies. Medicine, from anesthetic to antiseptic to invasive surgery to antibiotics to x-rays and so on and so on. Business, the marshaling of capital on a large scale, the development of financial markets, the international network of businesses, the increased number and variety of career opportunities. Undergraduates worry about getting a job. And they say, how many career opportunities do you have now compared to 600 years ago? Right? Free markets are an Enlightenment product. Liberal democratic government, constitutionalism, the end of slavery, the diminishment and almost ending of the subordination of women, the very idea that progress is possible, and the liberating feeling of optimism that comes with believing in progress, the exponentially rising wealth, the major increases in the available leisure time that we all enjoy, a more than doubling of average life expectancy, near universal literacy, the explosion in the arts, just in the sheer amount of painting, novel writing, poetry writing, sculpture, and music that's being created, the development of new art forms like the movie. Now, I think that the philosophy that underlies all of that is worth saving, okay? But it needs constant saving. The Enlightenment philosophy was not completed. It did not develop a satisfactory realist epistemology, and it did not develop an individualistic ethic. Those were the things that left it vulnerable. Those were the things at the fundamental level postmodernism attacking, the reason and the individualism. The themes of postmodernism are not new. They've always been a minority tradition in Western intellectual life. Western culture, in my reading of it, is uniquely self-conscious, and it often has doubts and second thoughts about its core values. And it is rich and strong enough to afford intellectuals who articulate those doubts. Many of those thinkers are deeply alienated from their cultures. Rousseau, most famously, Marx to a large extent, Nietzsche in some respects, and with more justification. But what's different about postmodernism now is that it is the dominant academic tradition in the humanities, and it's in a position to do serious damage, more serious damage. So the question then is, how do we go about defeating it? The task of professional philosophers is to deal with all of postmodernism's components, to develop the technical arguments needed to respond to postmodernism comprehensively, from metaphysics and epistemology through ethics and political theory. But there's a division of labor here in two ways. Professional philosophy is a very small, though foundational part of the academy. And so there's a huge amount of work that philosophically informed academics in other fields do. They pick up the debate as it applies to history, to law, to literary criticism, to educational theory, to the practice of science. The other division of labor is between those inside and outside the academy. The academy, again, is a small, very small, though foundational part of a whole culture. And there's a huge amount of cultural work that is done by informed, motivated, and committed individuals outside the academy. A culture is maintained by what is decided over the dinner table, on school boards, in local, state, and federal politics, on museums and art gallery boards, in debates in newspapers and magazines by people who write op-eds, columns, letters to the editors, in managers' meetings when people are deciding hiring policies, advertising campaigns, where to spend philanthropic dollars, in the coffee shop in the morning, the water cooler over break, in the bars and the restaurants in the evenings. In an open society, the debates go on at all levels of culture all the time. And so for interested parties, opportunities to confront postmodernism and to advance Enlightenment values are limitless. But nobody can do it all, so we each need to pick our targets. When I'm in the situation of arguing postmodernism, I've made it a policy to ask myself two questions early on in the discussion. I always seem to picture myself in a bar about midnight with fellow graduate students arguing over beer. I had my first significant encounters with postmodernism in graduate school. Most of graduate school goes on in the bars, not the library. So I think that made a least lasting impression. Now the two questions are, when I'm judging my interlocutor, first, is this person honest? Okay. And second, what matters most to this person? Okay. The first is important because it's easy to waste a lot of time discussing things with people who aren't really interested in thinking something through. They may seem to enjoy debate initially, but it's a game. Right? They're not really open to having their premises challenged or to think through their assumptions. The mark of this is almost always evasiveness, switching the subject when hot water is sensed. And it's just not worth it to pursue if your idea is to get to the truth here. Life is short. Now there's an exception here, especially when you're early in your career. If you want to sharpen your debating skills, then go for it. Or if you want to just really get a concrete image of how evasive people can be and learn to spot evasiveness, do it. Okay? The second question is, what matters most to this person? This question allows you to focus most effectively your time that you spend in the debate. For an example, any discussion about postmodernism is going to wander from politics to historical claims to epistemological claims about interpretation, relativism, and subjectivism. Now here's my bold claim. 95% of the time, the politics is what matters most to your interlocutor. So focus on that. Okay? The epistemology and whether the Aztecs really performed sacrifices, those are way secondary. Okay? They're window dressing. Okay? In my experience, if you're arguing with postmodernists, especially in English literature, law, and history, they didn't come to postmodernism via epistemology. They had a political agenda, and they only later backed into relativistic epistemology. So you're not going to change anyone's minds by proving that the census are valid or that Columbus was a nicer guy than Montezuma. Okay? There's a follow-up point here about focusing on the politics. And here I would recommend that you emphasize the positive. By that I mean focus on the case for capitalism and liberalism and de-emphasize arguing against socialism. Both of these need to be done. But not only is it more enjoyable to focus on talking about why capitalism is so great, it's more effective. Socialists are usually well aware of the problems of socialism, so mentioning them is fine, just to show them that you know what they are, but that's not going to make the case for capitalism. Socialism often gets much of its impetus from a failure to visualize any alternative. In part, this is driven by traditional mischaracterizations of capitalism, so hammer home the successes of the Enlightenment philosophy, medicine, standard of living, freedom, extension of the franchise, etc. There's lots and lots of data available, and these things can be used to great effect in debate. And hammer home especially the individualism that lies beneath the liberal capitalistic vision. The importance of being an end in yourself, setting your own goals, figuring out the means, prizing one's creativity, ingenuity, and responsibility. These are all the things that capitalism protects and nurtures, and these are the things that get people turned on. much more than a dismal listing of socialism's failings. All right, I have emphasized the politics and the psychology and de-emphasized the epistemology in dealing with postmodernism. Nonetheless, the epistemology is crucial, and the technical work in epistemology needs to be done and marketed effectively. And I think here objectivism has a unique voice. Without that, the philosophical world will be chronically subject to subjectivism, and in a climate of subjectivism, some future irrationalist cultural movement will rise up to take advantage of it. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Well, I can't tell you how good that makes me feel.
Okay, Steve, you talked a little bit about the what almost appears to be the personal characteristics of some of the leading postmodernists. Has anybody done any systematic analysis of them in comparison of these folks to try and illustrate more what their defects really are as people, as human beings? My sense is that that actually may be something that could be constructive in terms of trying to focus more on these people and their failures, their failings as individuals. I mean, you've touched on it, but
right.
It seems to me that it's useful to try and get at the psychology of these people. I mean, in effect, what's wrong with them? Why do they feel this bitterness, this alienation? What are the causes of it? As much as anything else, to help other people kind of maybe steer away from those characteristics.
Right. Well, it's obviously a very sensitive subject to raise within the academy. Right? When you start questioning people's motives, okay, you open the door to turning everything into ad hominem debate. I mean, debate is just going to shut down as soon as that becomes part of the academy. So people will shy away from it. In the public writings and the public lectures, what you will get then is an emphasis on arguing against the relativism. And it's not so much that you're trying to refute the refute the postmodernists to the postmodernists. Your audience is some other group of people, and you just say, this is what postmodernism leads to, it's ridiculous, and so don't you believe this as well. But you're quite right, though, that knowing that it's not just a philosophical movement, that it's also a psychological phenomenon that's going on, this can and should be very helpful to people in dealing with it, with them. And I don't think there's anything systematic that has been done. The only thing that comes to mind as partly approximating that project is a book by Paul Johnson called Intellectuals. Came out, I'm not sure how long ago, 8-10 years ago. And what he does is he goes through and he takes people like Rousseau and some of the 19th century utopian socialists and Marx and some of the Fabian socialists, and I think Bertrand Russell is in there as well. And they're all pretty much left politics, and he does show that that matched their personal lives, and that there was a lot of evidence that there was some destructive stuff going on in them psychologically. So I think it would be valuable to be done. I wonder how you could do it in the academy. Well, yes, sure, that's where, and I think that's where it does go on. Yeah, people are a little freer to, or in a friendly audience like this.
Steve, I think your analysis was fantastic, so thanks for a great job.
Thank you.
Since you ended with some debating tips, I thought I'd take the liberty of giving a couple of my own that I think mesh well with yours.
Please do.
I've had much more experience than I care to recall with debating these sort of people. The first is, but what about is not the beginning of an argument. There's no argument that begins, but what about the poor? Mm-hmm. But what about anything? Well, what about the environment? Very careful, if you want to debate successfully in here, you have to be very careful that when the ball's in their court, make sure you leave it there. Right? This is a tactic that I find them to use all the time. But what about the poor? And, well, but what about the poor? What am I supposed to say? The worst thing you can do is to jump on that and start giving some random flailings about the poor. Right? Whatever comes to your mind. If they've got some concern about the poor, make them tell you what their concern is.
Right.
And that brings...
And also, if I could just add on that point, if you sense that what the person's strategy is, they've got a core disagreement with capitalism that's not going to be budged, and there's just a whole bunch of what about the poors, and there's going to be another what about as soon as you finish this one, right? Then don't go down that road. Try to figure out what that core thing is.
And I think that that's sort of a corollary of a more basic principle. When you're arguing with someone about convictions that differ, you should tell people what you think and the reasons that you think it. And they should be telling you what they think and the reasons that they think it. Not some argument that they once heard that they think kind of supports it, right? Not an argument that they hope might win, but you should ask people, you think that? I don't want to hear some abstract argument that you once heard why you think that you think might work. I want to know, why do you think this is true? So that if I can refute that argument, you can't any longer think that it's true.
Right.
Okay? Because it's amazing how often I find myself saying to somebody, why do you think that? And they'll tell me. And I refute it then, and they say, well, how about this?
Yeah.
Right? But what about the poor?
Right. Okay.
Anyway, those are my two tips.
Right.
And again,
so following
thanks.
up on the second one, I think it's the same spirit as that strategy is to get the person pinned down to something. Right. So your position is this. Right? And this is your most important argument against, say, capitalism or whatever. And then say, if I can show you that that argument doesn't work, are you going to change your mind? And they will say yes or no. All right. And then your options are obvious. Okay, your choice. Yeah. Michael. Oh, sorry, not Michael.
This is Rick. Yeah.
Rick.
When you're doing writing about this sort of thing, you don't have the opportunity to have people voice their objection and then to get back to epistemology. And so when you write, say, in defense of capitalism, the reader might say, well, that's just an opinion or whatever, and then you can get back into those issues, but that never comes out in the writing because it's not a dialogue. So is there any solution to that problem?
Could you rephrase once again what the problem
Okay.
is? The lack of dialogue?
Well, because it requires a dialogue to go from the politics and then back to the epistemology. When you write, say you write in defense of, you're talking about capitalism and you're defending it, and they say, well, that's just an opinion or that's all relative, and then you can get back to the epistemology.
Okay.
But when you write, you don't. It's not like that. It's you defend capitalism, and then your article or your paper is done, and then there could be discussion later, but it's not going to get to your audience, and only the political issue gets to the audience.
Right.
Unless you're writing like a whole treatise or something, and then you don't get back to the epistemology. So is there any way of addressing everything in the same package without being just, while still staying on the same theme?
Yes, and I think that's always the challenge of writing. I mean, writing versus dialogue has the defects that you're mentioning. It's much slower in terms of the feedback. The dialogue does go on, but it goes on at a much slower pace. Now, how then, I think this is just a general writing question, how do you pick your target and then tailor your piece of writing so that it effectively reaches that target, given that you can't do it all at a particular time? Now, in my presentation here, for example, today, we're all over the map, okay? Talking about just about everything. Okay? And so the trade-off there is necessarily everything needs to be done with a much broader brush. Okay? Now, the trick then is just to do it without sacrificing the accuracy, and that's just the challenge of knowing your field. If you don't want to paint with that broad a brush because you know the particular audience you're dealing with is going to raise fairly specific objections, and you are then going to be wanting to deal with those objections, then you need to paint with a narrower brush so that you can phrase the issues in a way that allows you to deal with the objections. So that way, what you're doing is anticipating the kinds of criticisms that you want to answer, and then tailoring your presentation in a way that you have like a dialogue within yourself. So you say, here's my position. Now someone might say this, and here's the answer to that.
Steve, first, ditto, great talk.
Thank you.
My question is, how did the postmodernists deal with Rummel's statistics? I mean, it seems like if murder is no big deal to you, then the Kierkegaardian or Machiavellian angle is fine. And if it does bother you, then nihilism is the answer. Or do they just take that approach that some people like the white supremacists, the skinheads have taken like the Holocaust never happened. It's just a fraud. It's part of a worldwide Zionist plot type thing.
I don't know of any postmodernist responses directly to Rummel. But the kinds of responses that we could anticipate getting would be first kind of technical responses of the kinds that I'm starting to get rumbles about over lunch and stuff. Well, how exactly is he defining democracy, and what about the Spanish-American War? Doesn't that count, and stuff like that? So the social scientists, of course, would have to pick apart his methodology and see how good his categorizations are. But supposing the numbers are more or less right to an open-minded audience, then the kinds of rhetorical strategies that postmodernists are going to come up with are just going to be the same kinds of ones that socialists have always come up with. They're just going to say, well, your interpretation of the data is a capitalistic interpretation of the data. Or they will say, the Soviet Union wasn't really socialistic. Right? So you redefine the terms. That was not what socialism is about, so on. And maybe they believe that, maybe they don't.
In your outline, you mentioned a prediction that postmodernism will not survive another generation.
Thank you.
Could you elaborate and explain that, please?
Because I cut that for time. I would have 4 reasons why I think postmodernism won't succeed. It won't last for very long. And the first, the deepest one, is that it doesn't have anything to say. Right? Okay. No, I mean that, well, yeah. I mean that in all the ways. I mean, we can say that at a very abstract philosophical level. It's false, so ultimately it's not going to be useful as a framework for understanding the world or us and so forth. But also the postmodernists themselves are saying they don't really have anything to say about the world. And so ultimately then what you're going to have is kind of an inbred movement where people start just saying the same old formulaic stuff over and over again. Right? And there was, Will Wilkerson sent me this website that has this postmodernist generator. You can just take all of the stock phrases and it will just arbitrarily put them together at random, but abiding by the rules of grammar. And so you have a real postmodernist book, the generator version, and yeah. Now that's a sign that there's a problem. Okay. Okay. All right. Now I think that means it will become an inbred group, which means that bright, decent students who are coming in to get an education will say, these people don't have anything to say. I mean, I think the psychologically disturbed people will hang around because it's going to push their buttons in the right way. But the healthy people will go off and do various other things. Second, I think because of postmodernism's emphasis on everything being ad hominem, it's going to be a socially destructive movement. I don't think it can retain its cohesiveness, and what you will then have is faction. Okay? And anybody who hurts my feelings within my group will then be lashed out against by me. And there are lots of examples of this happening right now. I mean, there was a fairly healthy debate about Heidegger's Nazism, right, and how deeply that influenced or was influenced by his deeper philosophical convictions. Right? And this is a problem because Nazism has had some bad press. Okay? And many deconstructionists will say that they are socialists, and so the opposite of what the Nazis are, but nonetheless, here's their main guy, and he is there. And so even after the evidence came out and was fairly compelling about Heidegger's Nazism, some people within the postmodernist movement then started saying, well, okay, maybe we need to distance ourselves a little from Heidegger. Now, the main disciples of Heidegger, Derrida, then mainly went loopy and crazy, insane, attacking the various people who were not towing the line. I mean, Heidegger can't be a bad guy. Okay? And if you are going to raise publicly dissent, then we're going to, in effect, excommunicate you. And the kinds of vituperation that went on, just, well, maybe you do have some sense of what that would be. My third reason was that usually slowly and reluctantly you get some fairly healthy counter reactions. Okay? What usually goes on, say, in literary criticism or in the sciences is you've got people working out the modernist agenda. They're doing good literary criticism, they're doing good history, they're doing good science. Then postmodernism grows and becomes enough of a nuisance that the good people say, okay, I need to take some time off my work in order to attack the deconstructionists and postmodernists. And so what you then get is some good works that are written and show just what the problems are with postmodernism and deconstructionism and so on, and those serve as a way to keep that sector healthy. And there are a number of good works that have been written in the last 5 years, and there are some I would recommend also. Finally, postmodernism is in effect empty, is tying in with my first point. I mean, if you take all of the claims that they make that are usually put in a third-person perspective and put them in the first-person perspective, you can see that there's a huge vacuum here. I mean, they will say, nobody knows anything about reality. Put that in the first person. I don't have a clue. Okay? Emotion trumps reason. I'm just going by my feelings. Okay? Ad hominem political tactics are justified. I'm going to do anything I can, fair or foul, to get you. That is just empty. Okay? And what that means is it's going to leave a huge vacuum for someone to come along and fill. And I think this is why, in a way, it's bad that postmodernism dominates in the humanities, but in a way it's good, because this is a real opportunity for objectivism to get in there and fill that vacuum. So that's why I don't think it'll last, for those 4 reasons.
It seems that one of the ways that ideas like postmodernism get out into popular mainstream is through art and popular culture and that sort of thing. Can you comment on ways that postmodernism is seen in popular movies, books, and that sort of thing? Is it present there? Are we seeing it? Are people picking up on these ideas sort of subconsciously through the movies that they see and popular culture in general?
Well, here I'm getting out of my depth, right, because I don't necessarily keep up enough with the current trends in all of these popular culture manifestations. I still think there's a fairly strong division in the arts and cultural movements between high culture, which is fairly nihilistic, and popular culture, which is pretty healthy, still pretty modernistic. And so if you look at, say, architecture, okay, you can find modernist stuff going on, and you can also find postmodernist stuff going on, like that new Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. Right, that's clearly postmodernist. It's just chaos and intentionally chaos. In literature, you've got deconstruction works or postmodernist works of literature, and they are read by other people in the academy, but outside the academy, you've got the booming popular culture. And I think the same thing goes on. Now, are there strains of postmodernism running through popular culture? Well, yeah, of course. And I'm sure if we look around, we can always find a few. But I don't think they're dominant in popular culture. I think popular culture is still by and large modernist. It's still good. I think science is still by and large modernist. Business is anything in the technical field. Those are all pretty healthy.
I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last one, Michael. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, well, thank you.